Yo, what's going on people? It's your boy Huncho, and this is Brits on Death Row. Brits on Death Row is a limited series where we take a look at some British nationals that are either currently on death row or potentially facing death row, have died on death row, or have had their death row sentence overturned. I've explained this in previous episodes, but if you didn't know, here in the UK, the death penalty or capital punishment was abolished in 1965, but remained for certain crimes such as treason all the way up until 1998. Now, normally the cases that we would take a look at happened after 1998, so this would mean that the cases would take place in foreign countries, but today we're rewinding to 1964, which means the death row case we'll be taking a look at today happened here in the United Kingdom, and this is the Peter Anthony Allen and Gwynne Owen Evans case, the last two men to be sentenced to death in the United Kingdom. Gwynne Owen Evans, born the 1st of April 1940 in Maryport, Cumberland, was actually born with the name John Robson Walby, but the reason for the name change will become a bit clearer as the story goes on. He was the third eldest child in his family, and the family was said to have held strong Catholic beliefs, which Gwynne would have been raised up with. On the outside, he seemed like a fairly average child, where he attended the Boy Scouts and also took part in the church choir, but from an early age it was clear that Gwynne was suffering from some kind of mental health issues. In reports, it's claimed that he would occasionally attend the Dovenby Hall Colony, which is located in Cockermouth, and he attended here during his teenage years, but this would have been before the age of 15. Now, a lot of you watching might be thinking to yourself, well, what's a colony? And these were actually set up between World War I and World War II, and surprisingly they were used all the way up until the 1990s. They were set up to help and aid people who were disabled or mentally ill, but according to some news sources that reported on this story a couple of years back, they described them as places that were set up to keep disabled or mentally ill people away from the rest of society, adding that they were essentially independent communities of disabled people with their own accommodation, shops, markets and more. In these colonies, believe it or not, people were actually categorised, and remember, this is going back to the early mid-1900s, so society's view on disabled people was completely different back then. According to the Mental Deficiency Act of 1913, which was later changed to the Mental Health Act of 1959, and from later reports from medical examiners at Durham Prison, Gwynne was considered to be, quote, of moral defect rather than disabled. You see, he'd been sent to the colony for help because he was untrustworthy, lacked moral sense, was untruthful, and was inclined to steal, which again put him in the category of moral defect. Gwynne would go on to leave school at the age of 15, and he would go on to work as a page boy at a hotel in Carlisle, and then as an engine cleaner for British Railways. In 1957, at this point, he would have been about 17. He was then handed a supervision order and was ordered to stay at a hostel in Bristol. Later on that same year though, he attempted to join the army, and it was actually successful for a short while, but in the end would prove unsuccessful. He attempted to join the Border Regiment, but they expelled him in March of 1958 after he was discharged because he was unfit under existing standards. He was sent to a doctor while in the regiment who wrote, "This soldier was sent to me by his training wing officer on account of his frequent telling of big lies, which he apparently believed himself." He then enlisted once again in November of 1958, but would go on to be discharged in February of 1959 on the grounds of, quote, personality inadequacy. Personality inadequacy isn't diagnosed by doctors anymore, as there's a wide range of other medical explanations for this condition. According to his commanding officer at the time, he said he's a failure, he cannot make friends because of feeling superior and telling complete fairy tales all the time. After he was discharged at this time, he decided to drop his birth name of John Robson Walby and started using the alias Owen Evans. He would go on to work at the railways once again, and then even applied for the Royal Air Force and was accepted in July of 1959, but would go on to be discharged in November of the same year because he was physically unfit for Air Force service on the grounds of nervous instability. So after attempting to join the armed forces on various occasions and that not working out for Gwynne, he decided to return to Cumbria and would start working short-term roles for various different jobs. In September of 1960, he began working at Lakeland Laundry in Workington, and it was here he got to know a man by the name of John Allen West. John Allen West will become a key figure as the story goes on, so just bear that one in mind. In 1961, Gwynne would take it upon himself to move over to Birmingham, and here he worked doing various jobs such as being a kitchen porter, a driver and a lift attendant. 2 years later, in 1963, Gwynne was convicted by Carlisle Magistrates Court of larceny, later known as theft, of 5 shillings in cash, as well as obtaining 16 shillings in cash and a railway ticket by false pretences in a separate incident. You see, Gwynne had actually stole the 5 shillings from a friend whilst he was distracted, and obtained the 16 shillings from a loan from the local police station, claiming that he lost his wallet at his mother's funeral. For this, he was fined £5 with 4 days detention, and actually went on to serve those 4 days. Now, as you guys know, up until now, Gwynne was actually using the alias Owen Evans rather than his birth name, but after being released from detention, he would add Gwynne to his name and would now go by the name of Gwynne Owen Evans. In the following months after his release, he would actually go on to serve a 3-month jail sentence in Dudley after he was found driving a motor vehicle without a licence and using a driving licence with intent to deceive. In 1963, he signed up to the army for a final time, but was discharged on the 14th of November. That was around a month later, because his criminal convictions now came to light and he failed to disclose them to the army. After being discharged from the army a final time, Gwynne decided to move to Preston, but before we get into what happened in Preston, we have to rewind back to 1943, where we now meet Peter Anthony Allen, who was born on the 4th of April 1943 in Wallasey, Cheshire. Peter was the second son to his parents, and after attending a secondary modern school in Wallasey, just like Gwynne, he left at the age of 15. But it wasn't just leaving school at the same age which would mirror Gwynne's life, it was pretty much everything after that as well. Within a month of leaving school, he obtained 2 jobs, but within the same month, he was dismissed for carelessness, but would later find employment as a pipe cleaner for 3 months. Again, just how Gwynne had tried to enroll in the armed forces, so did Peter, and on the 10th of July 1958, he enlisted as a junior gunner in the Junior Leaders Regiment of the Royal Artillery, and after serving 11 months, he would go on to be discharged on the 13th of June 1959 on the grounds of, quote, no longer required. Upon being discharged, though, he was given a good character reference. In the following 2 years after being discharged from the army, Peter worked for 2 trucking companies, but would go on to be dismissed by one of them in October of 1961 because he was actually given a promotion and was unable to handle the responsibility. In the previous year of 1960, whilst still working as a trucker, it would be here Peter received his first criminal conviction for aiding and abetting the taking of a car, and for this he was given a conditional discharge. On the 11th of November 1961, Peter married a woman by the name of Mary who worked as a cinema usherette. The couple had a Catholic wedding and relocated to Manchester. Towards the end of that same November, Peter found a job as a scrap dealer but was dismissed in April of the following year for poor timekeeping. For the following 6 months he worked in dairy, and this was followed by 6 months in steelworks. He then relocated to Preston in 1963, where he found a job working as a labourer with an agricultural trading society. Now, some might call it fate or destiny, but for whatever reason, at this point, as you guys know, Gwynne was also in Preston after relocating there, and believe it or not, when he actually landed in Preston, he lodged with Peter and his wife. From reports though, it's unclear how the two initially met each other. The pair would even go on to work at the agricultural trading society together, but after 2 months, Peter injured his back, which seen him unfit for work, and he would go on to be discharged in January of 1964. And in regards to Gwynne working there, it's believed he worked there for roughly a month or so. Once discharged though, the duo started to commit crimes together, leaving their life of somewhat working men, although dabbling in a bit of crime, to full-time criminals. Towards the end of January 1964, the crime partners removed lead flashing from an empty house, and a week later they broke open a cigarette machine and stole the contents. Now, although they started out as petty thefts, it would turn a little bit more serious as time went on. The pair went on to steal a car and a van, where they used them in burglaries across several premises. An attempt was made to cover the van's registration number, which led to their eventual arrests, and they were handed £10 fines for this. In February, they would go on to be employed by a dairy company so they could pay this fine off, Records don't make it clear what their exact roles were, but either way they would both go on to be sacked for not turning up to work on time. But with no job, little education, a long list of a criminal record, and now facing a £10 fine, the pair would go back to committing crime to repay the debt, but this time would be their last because the events that unfolded on the 7th of April 1964 would see both Gwynne and Peter be the last two men sentenced to death in the United Kingdom. Now, although the events of the 7th of April 1964 would see both men eventually be given the death penalty, we have to rewind back to September of 1960, where Gwynne had worked for Lakeland Laundry in Workington, and this, if you guys remember, is where he met John Allen West. You see, John had been working for Lakeland Laundry for 30 years as a van driver at that point in 1960, and 4 years on in 64, he still continued to work there as a van driver. In fact, he worked there for that long, he was gifted a 17-karat gold watch from the company for his commitment to them. At the age of 53, John had been living as a single man by himself at 18 Kings Avenue in Workington, and because he never had his own family or a wife, it was thought that John could have been gay. But we have to remember, around this time, being gay, believe it or not, in the UK was actually illegal. From 1960 until 1964, it's believed that Gwynne and John had kept up some kind of relationship with each other. The details were never truly known, but in an article written about this case a couple years back, they claimed that it was suggested that the two were secretly together. Now remember, it had to be a secret because being gay was illegal in the UK at this point. Either way though, John and his single status living by himself would end up proving fatal for him when it was all said and done. On the evening of the 6th of April 1964, both Peter and Gwynne stole a Ford Prefect car from outside a pub in Preston with the intent to drive the car to Cumbria. If you remember, both men were in need of money because they needed to pay their £10 fines off. Some reports claim it's possible that during the journey, Gwynne remembered that John, who he had worked with previously and potentially had been in a secret relationship with, was a single man living by himself and had been gifted that expensive watch by his workplace, and thought to himself it could be an easy robbery and therefore they could pay the £10 fines off. In regards to John, on the 6th of April, he arrived home after a normal day's shift at around 6 PM and was settling down for the night. As the evening turned to night, Peter, Gwynne, Peter's wife Mary and their two children made the trip to John's house and arrived at around 1:10 in the morning on the following day, that being the 7th. Mary and the kids were fast asleep in the car when they eventually arrived at John's house, and what happens next is unclear because both Peter and Gwynne tell different stories, but what is known is that John would open the door to allow either one or both of them in. At around 3 AM though, next door neighbours were woken by a commotion of thuds coming through the walls of the house. When they eventually looked out the bedroom window, they caught glimpses of the Ford Prefect driving away. In a somewhat panic because it was 3 AM in the morning, the neighbours decided to call the police. When they arrived, emergency services found John dead after he suffered severe head injuries and a stab wound to the chest. Sergeant James Park of Lancashire Constabulary later told the Liverpool Echo, "I saw the body of a man lying on the floor at the foot of the stairs. There was a large amount of blood on the floor and the man was obviously dead." But the police were a little confused because it was clear that no one had broken into John's house, and according to his neighbour, he was the only person to have access to spare keys. And it became apparent to police that whoever John let in his house would eventually go on to murder him. After the discovery of John's dead body though, the police set up roadblocks in the bids to get hold of the situation, and they also opened a murder inquiry. During the investigation, the police noted that John had suffered a pretty bad death. He'd been hit on the head with a metal pipe and had been stabbed in the heart. The chief superintendent would even go on to tell reporters that it resembled a, quote, bloodbath. A pathologist who examined John's body would go on to explain in more detail that there were 6 grazes to the face and upper body, as well as 6 bruises and various brain contusions. There was also a stab wound to the left side of the chest, which had pierced through the heart. The doctor concluded, "In my opinion, Death resulted from hemorrhage and shock caused by a stab wound to the heart and multiple head injuries. Investigating officers also discovered that John was definitely a well-off man, because he wasn't just in possession of things such as that expensive watch, he had also recently inherited a large sum of money from his mother and sister, who had died just 9 months apart from each other. When searching for items that could have potentially been stolen from him, it was discovered that the gold watch was in fact taken, and bank books were also missing, which meant that Gwynne and Peter could go on to withdraw money from his account. So now a motive was established by police that John was murdered as the result of some kind of robbery. Upon checking John's bedroom for clues, they found something that would break the investigation wide open and in turn solve the case pretty quickly. In John's bedroom, officers discovered a discarded raincoat, and it didn't belong to John because it didn't fit him. When the pockets of the jacket were searched, a medallion inscribed with the words G.O. Evans, July 1961 was found. A memo form was also found with the medallion, which had the name Miss Norma O'Brien, with her address, which was located in Liverpool. Liverpool police were quick to trace down a 17-year-old girl, that being factory worker Norma O'Brien. When police made contact with her, she told police that while staying with her sister and brother-in-law in Preston, she met a man by the name of Ginger Owen Evans, or as you guys will know him as Gwynne Owen Evans, and confirmed that she had seen Ginger Owen Evans, or Gwynne, wearing the medallion. After talking with police, she was driven up to Kendal, Westmoreland, where she went on to identify the medallion. During the investigation, it was discovered that the stolen Ford Prefect was later abandoned in a builder's yard in Ormskirk, Lancashire. Gwynne had apparently asked a neighbour whether he could leave it there, and the neighbour, after believing that Gwynne was acting suspicious, went on to call police on the evening of April 7th, 1964, only hours after the murder of John West had taken place. When the police arrived, they matched the car to one that had been stolen previously, and the descriptions of the person who stole the car were those of Gwynne's, so at this point police were only investigating Gwynne and not Peter, although when they searched the car for clues, Gwynne and Peter's fingerprints had been all over it. So with all the evidence mounting up against Gwynne at this point, it was time for them to make their arrests. At around 1 PM on the 8th of April 1964, only one day after the murder had taken place, police turned up in search of Gwynne at Peter's home on Clarendon Road in Preston, because if you remember, he had been living there with Peter and his wife. When they turned up, Gwynne wasn't there, but Peter was, and he agreed to go to the police station in Preston. He was then driven up to Kendal before finally going to Workington, where the murder squad was based. In questioning, he claimed to have been at home with his wife and a person by the name of Sandy Evans on the night of the murder. When police asked him where his wife was, he told them that she was visiting her mother in Manchester and gave police the address. A police officer went to the address to find only the mother there. The police officer left, telling her he would wait outside for Mary to return. A few hours later, Mary did return, and she went out immediately to the police car to tell the officer where to find Gwynne. Soon after, he was found on a street corner at Phillips Park Road in Miles Platting, and upon a search he was in possession of John's watch, but he claimed at first that he had purchased it earlier on that day. He was taken to a police station in Middleton, and when he was told he was being arrested on suspicion of John's murder, he went on to admit that he, alongside Peter, Mary and the children, had gone to borrow money from John, but claimed that Peter was the person who was responsible for the murder. And then at this point, police would go on to place Mary and her 2 children under arrest. When Peter found out that his wife and children had been arrested and was taken into custody, he went on to explain to police that it was Gwynne who suggested to rob John, and initially Gwynne had went into John's by himself, and at some point later he let Peter in the hopes that John would not notice him sneaking into the house, but he said when John came downstairs and discovered him being there, this led to a fight. Peter would go on to say that Gwynne gave him an iron bar in which he used to hit John. When Gwynne was later questioned by police, he would go on to say things such as that he was an innocent man and he's being honest with them, and the reason he had gone to Workington was to borrow money from John because John had previously made it clear that he would always loan him cash if he was short. Gwynne then claimed after he failed to get a loan, Peter turned on John and started to attack him. Gwynne did admit to police though that he had stole the watch. watch. In Gwynne's own words, he said, "I went into the hall and I saw Peter hitting John with something that looked like a pipe. He had him up against the wall and there was a lot of blood." He continued he knew nothing about a knife and did not have one, even though at that point in questioning, the police had not yet revealed anything about John being stabbed. At around 1:15 AM on the 9th of April 1964, which would have been roughly 36 hours after John was murdered, both Peter and Gwynne would go on to be charged with his murder. But after both men pleaded not guilty to the charges brought against them, a trial was to go ahead at the Manchester Assize. Now, for you guys who don't know, the Assize was a regional court circuit held twice yearly in March and April, and then in July and August, but could be held in the winter if there were a large number of cases. These would eventually be abolished in 1971 though, and were replaced by a single Crown Court. But back to the story, a trial was to go ahead on July 1st, 1964, and it was heard that the charges brought against the pair were for capital murder under the Homicide Act of 1957 because John had been murdered in the course of a theft. There was also additional charges of robbery with aggravation of 2 bank passbooks and a gold watch. From court details that I can find, the prosecution in the case expected Gwynne to plead diminished responsibility given his previous mental health conditions, and this was going to be backed up because the defence lined up a psychiatrist who had actually met Gwynne twice previously. Like doctors who had seen him prior, that psychiatrist went on to say that Gwynne was suffering from mental health conditions and that responsibility for his actions were impaired, but again, not substantially. However, the following day, without any explanation, Gwynne's lawyers decided to drop the diminished responsibility plea, and the only note left on the prosecution's file reads, "Defense advised diminished responsibility not being raised, Dr. Begg informed." Over the course of the trial, it was heard that both men blamed each other for the murder, but the evidence against Peter was believed to have been much stronger because, again, he admitted to beating John, and his clothes were also soaked in blood. There was no blood found on Gwynne. But Peter claimed to have only struck John with a few blows, and it was Gwynne that had used the knife to stab John in the heart. Gwynne was still sticking to his story that because John didn't give him a loan, Peter went on to attack him and in turn killed him, and Gwynne said he agreed to do the robbery provided there would be no violence involved. In court, Gwynne also proved himself to be a liar because he was speaking with a Welsh accent even though he was from Cumbria, and told the court he adopted a Welsh name because he had discovered his parents were both German. He held no real logic to his words, and he appeared to continue creating stories and half-truths about himself. In court, Peter's wife Mary would come to her husband's defence after sticking to her original police statement, which said that Gwynne had led Peter into John's home and that both men had been responsible for attacking John. She also said that Gwynne had thrown the knife used to murder John out of the window of the car, and that Gwynne had made some kind of remark about stabbing John. Mary also told the court that she hated Gwynne, even though Gwynne's defence were able to prove that she had been in some kind of romantic relationship with him because they presented evidence that she was sending love letters to him while he was awaiting trial in Durham prison. Peter's defence would go on to say that there was evidence Gwynne had sex with John just before the murder, something that Gwynne had denied in court, but was actually backed up by medical evidence. The trial ended on the 6th of July with the prosecution basically turning around and saying that both men were acting in quote concert and it didn't matter who delivered the fatal blow. The following day, after 3 hours of deliberation, the jury came back and found both men guilty of capital murder and robbery. It was then they were sentenced to death, and in turn would be the last men sentenced to death in the United Kingdom. After their sentences, both men appealed their verdicts, but this would prove unsuccessful for both, and on July 20th, a death sentence would be set for the 13th of August 1964. One of the appeal judge's remarks is heard as saying, "A more brutal murder it would be hard to imagine." But this came to a shock to most of the community and even the local police who oversaw the case, because by this point a modern United Kingdom was rising and capital punishment was on its way out of the door. In fact, half of the United Kingdom had abolished it by this point, and it was literally a roll of the dice whether you'd be sentenced to death or not, depending on where you was located. In 1964, no executions had taken place, with only 2 taking place in the previous year. So after failed appeal hearings, the only option left was a reprieve. A reprieve in a nutshell is basically, in this case, stopping the death penalty from happening and moving it to a life sentence instead. But after writing to the Home Secretary who oversaw the reprieves, eventually this would be denied for both, with Home Secretary Henry Brooke writing, "I regret I can find no mitigating circumstances such as would justify a reprieve in either case. The law must take its course." On the 13th of August 1964, at around 8 p.m, Peter, who was being held at Liverpool's Walton Prison, and Gwynne, who was being held at Manchester's Strangeways Prison, were led to the gallows and at the same time, miles apart from each other, were hung to death. But little did they know, only 15 months later, the death penalty in the United Kingdom was abolished completely for crimes such as murder. And that is the death row case of Peter Anthony Allen and Gwynne Owen Evans, the last two men to be sentenced to death in the United Kingdom. If you like this series, give the video a thumbs up. Let me know what you guys think of this down in the comment section below. And if you want the latest drill, street and music news out of the UK, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. It's been your boy Huncho, and I'm out.